Victor Harrington checked his gold watch for the third time that morning. The hospital hallway felt too small for his tall frame as he paced back and forth. At 42, Victor had built one of the most successful real estate companies in the city. He knew how to solve problems, how to make deals happen, and how to turn failing properties into gold mines. But nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment. Behind the closed door, his wife Eliza had been in labor for nearly 14 hours. Victor had imagined this day many times, holding his son, teaching him to throw a baseball, seeing himself in the boy's eyes. These dreams kept him going through the long nights of building his empire. "Mr. Harrington." The doctor's voice broke through his thoughts. "You can come in now." Victor rushed into the room. Eliza looked exhausted, but was smiling as she held their newborn son. "Meet Thomas," she whispered. The baby was perfect with 10 tiny fingers and toes. Victor felt tears forming in his eyes as he gently held his son for the first time. This was the heir to everything he had built. The first few weeks at home were filled with joy, but also with growing concern. Thomas didn't seem to react to sounds. When doors slammed or phones rang, the baby continued sleeping peacefully. "It's probably nothing," Eliza said, trying to convince herself more than Victor. But at Thomas's 2-month checkup, their fears became reality. After several tests, the doctor sat them down with a serious face. "I'm afraid Thomas was born with severe hearing loss," the doctor explained. "He will likely never be able to hear or speak normally." The words hit Victor like a punch to the stomach. His dreams of teaching his son to talk, of hearing him say "Dad" for the first time, shattered in that moment. The following months were the hardest of their lives. Victor threw himself into research, consulting specialists across the country. Eliza quit her job to care for Thomas full-time, learning basic sign language even though Thomas was still an infant. One night, after another day of Thomas crying for hours without understanding why his parents couldn't help him, Victor found Eliza sitting on the bathroom floor, sobbing. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted. "I love him so much, but I don't know if we're what's best for him." Victor's sister Catherine called the next day. She had worked as a speech therapist for 15 years, specializing in helping deaf children. "I heard about Thomas," she said. "How are you both holding up?" Victor couldn't hold back anymore. He told her about their struggles, their fears, and their feeling of failure. "Let me help," Catherine offered. "I could take Thomas for a while, just until you both get some rest and figure things out." What started as a temporary arrangement slowly became permanent. Catherine lived in a community with an excellent school for deaf children. She sent photos and videos of Thomas learning sign language, smiling, and growing. Meanwhile, Victor's business demanded more of his attention, and his marriage with Eliza was falling apart under the weight of guilt and grief. On Thomas's first birthday, Victor made the hardest decision of his life. He signed papers giving Catherine legal guardianship of his son. He promised to provide financial support, but knew in his heart he was walking away from his responsibility as a father. "Sometimes love means doing what's best for your child," he told himself as he drove away from Catherine's house that day, even when it breaks her heart. But deep down, Victor knew he was running away, from difficulty, from failure, from the son who would never hear him say "I love you." 10 years passed. Victor's face appeared on the cover of business magazines. "Real estate king transforms downtown," read one headline. His company now owned buildings in 3 states, and he had recently opened an office in London. But success came with a price. Victor and Eliza divorced when Thomas was 3. Without their son at home, they discovered they had little left to talk about. Eliza moved to California, remarried, and rarely mentioned Thomas to anyone. Victor lived alone in a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The walls were covered with expensive art, but there were no family photos. His assistant kept track of Thomas's birthday and Christmas, sending gifts with cards Victor signed but didn't write. The arrangement felt clean, simple, and increasingly empty. One spring morning, Victor received an envelope from Catherine. Inside was a drawing of a house with a family standing outside. The colors were bright, and the skill level was impressive for a child. A note from Catherine explained that Thomas, now 11, had won a school art contest. Victor studied the drawing. The family had 4 people, a woman with red hair like Catherine, her husband Paul, their daughter Emma, and a boy who must be Thomas. Victor was not in the picture. He placed the drawing in his desk drawer, unsure why it bothered him so much. "Mr. Harrington, your 10 o'clock is waiting," his assistant reminded him through the intercom. Victor pushed thoughts of Thomas away and returned to what he knew best, making money. Catherine, meanwhile, had created a warm home for Thomas. She had married Paul, a kind music teacher who learned sign language to communicate with Thomas. They had a daughter, Emma, and the four of them lived in a modest house near Thomas's school. Thomas thrived under Catherine's care. Though he could not hear, his other senses were sharp. He noticed everything: how leaves changed colors, how people's faces showed their true feelings, how light fell differently each hour of the day. These observations made him an exceptional artist. At school, Thomas had friends who were also deaf. They played sports, went camping, and learned together. But sometimes, when he saw fathers picking up their children, Thomas would grow quiet and withdraw into himself. "Why doesn't my real father visit me?" he asked Catherine one night, his hands forming the signs with sharp, angry movements. Catherine sat beside him on his bed. "Your father." She paused, searching for the right words. "He believes you have a better life here with us." "Because I'm broken?" Thomas signed. "No." Catherine's hands moved firmly. "You are not broken. You are exactly who you're supposed to be." But Thomas didn't look convinced. That night, he drew a picture of a tall man standing far away from a small boy. A wide river separated them. Back in his office, Victor rarely spoke of his son. His new girlfriends, usually models or executives in their 20s, didn't know Thomas existed. When they asked about children, Victor would say, "Never had time for a family." On Thomas's 15th birthday, Victor sent a check instead of a gift. Catherine called to thank him, mentioning that Thomas was becoming quite talented with painting. "I'm sure that's wonderful," Victor said distantly. "Listen, Catherine, I'm heading into a meeting. The money is for anything he needs. Private art lessons, special equipment, whatever helps." "He needs his father, Victor," Catherine said softly. Victor looked at his schedule on the computer screen. "I have to go. Take care." That evening, Victor stood at his window, looking at the city lights below. The emptiness of his beautiful apartment seemed to mock him. He poured himself a drink and wondered, not for the first time, what Thomas looked like now. Did he have Victor's height? Eliza's eyes? Did he laugh like her? These thoughts came more often lately, appearing unexpectedly in quiet moments. Victor always pushed them away, focusing instead on the next deal, the next million. But the space between his success and his secret grew heavier each year. At 18, Thomas Harrington stood in front of his latest painting in the high school art studio. His teacher, Mrs. Chen, watched as he added final touches to the canvas. The painting showed a young man standing at a crossroads, one path leading to a bright city, the other to a simple house surrounded by trees. "This is your best work yet," Mrs. Chen signed. "The emotion is so clear." Thomas smiled and wiped paint from his hands. Unlike most students who struggled to find their talent, Thomas had always known he was meant to be an artist. His inability to hear had sharpened his visual perception in ways that amazed his teachers. Catherine entered the studio, her face glowing with pride when she saw the painting. "Thomas, this is beautiful," she signed. Thomas hugged his aunt, the woman who had raised him and loved him as her own son. They had a big decision to make today. 3 college acceptance letters had arrived earlier that week. One was from the prestigious National Art Academy, the school of Thomas's dreams. The second was from a state university with a good program for deaf students. The third was from a local community college. The Art Academy offered the best education but had few resources for deaf students. The state university had excellent support but a weaker art program. The community college would allow Thomas to stay close to home. "I want to go to the National Art Academy," Thomas signed firmly as they drove home. "I know it will be harder for me there, but I need to challenge myself." Catherine nodded. A worry lined her face. The academy was expensive, even with the partial scholarship Thomas had received. Victor sent money regularly for Thomas's basic needs, but he had never discussed college plans. That evening, Catherine made a difficult call. Victor was in a hotel room in Chicago when his phone rang. Seeing Catherine's name surprised him. They usually communicated through email these days. "Victor, Thomas has been accepted to the National Art Academy," Catherine said without greeting. "It's one of the best art schools in the country." Victor felt an unexpected surge of pride. That's impressive. Yes, it is. He's very talented. But the tuition is high, even with his scholarship. The unspoken question hung between them. Victor cleared his throat. Of course I'll pay for his education. Email me the details. There's something else, Catherine continued. Thomas wants to meet you. Victor's hand tightened around the phone. Meet me? Why now? He's making big decisions about his future. He has questions only you can answer. After hanging up, Victor stared out the hotel window. The thought of meeting Thomas after all these years made his chest tight. What would he say? How could he explain his absence? Meanwhile, Thomas was packing his art supplies in his room. On his desk sat a small box containing the few things he had from his father: birthday cards with impersonal messages and a baby photo of himself in Victor's arms. Thomas often studied this photo, looking for similarities between himself and the stranger who was his father. Thomas had spent years wondering about Victor. When he was younger, he imagined fantastic reasons for his father's absence. Perhaps he was a secret agent or an astronaut on a long mission. As he grew older, he realized the truth was simpler and more painful. His father had chosen not to be part of his life. The summer passed quickly. Thomas prepared for college while working part-time at a local gallery. His paintings were beginning to sell, mostly landscapes and portraits that captured emotions in a way that words never could. One hot August afternoon, Thomas was helping hang a new exhibition when Catherine appeared at the gallery door. Her face looked strange, nervous and excited at the same time. Thomas, she signed, her hands slightly shaking. Your father is here. He wants to see you before you leave for college. Thomas froze. After years of wondering, of anger and curiosity fighting inside him, the moment had arrived. He placed the hammer carefully on a table and wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans. Catherine led him to the gallery's small office. Standing by the window was a tall man in an expensive suit, his dark hair now streaked with gray. When Victor turned and saw Thomas, his composed businessman's face cracked slightly, revealing something like fear. Thomas stood straight, suddenly aware of how similar they looked. Same height, same jawline. But while Victor's eyes showed uncertainty, Thomas's gaze was steady and calm. For a moment, father and son simply stared at each other across 18 years of absence. 7 years passed since that awkward first meeting in the gallery office. Thomas graduated from the National Art Academy with top honors. His paintings now hung in galleries across the country, and art critics called him the painter who makes silence visible. At 25, he had accomplished more than many artists twice his age. Victor had attended Thomas's graduation ceremony, sitting stiffly in the audience next to Catherine and her family. After that day, their contact remained minimal. An occasional email, a Christmas card, a brief visit when business brought Victor to. On a rainy Tuesday morning in October, Victor sat in his doctor's office, staring at the test results in his hands. The words blurred before his eyes. Kidney failure, advanced stage, transplant needed. How long do I have? Victor asked, his voice unnaturally calm. Dr. Morris removed his glasses. Without a transplant, maybe a year, possibly less. You'll need dialysis soon, but that's just a temporary solution. And my chances of finding a donor? We'll put you on the national waiting list immediately, but I have to be honest, the wait can be several years. Do you have any family members who might be willing to get tested? Victor thought of his younger brother who had died in a car accident years ago. His parents were both gone. There were no cousins he kept in contact with, and then, of course, there was Thomas. I'll make some calls, Victor said, folding the paper with trembling hands. Back in his office, Victor stared at his phone. How could he ask Thomas for such a thing? They barely knew each other. Yet the fear of death made him desperate in a way he had never experienced before. He dialed Catherine's number first. Catherine listened quietly as Victor explained his condition. Though they had their differences over the years, she felt genuine sadness hearing about his illness. I'm sorry, Victor. That's terrible news, she said. How can I help? I need to know if Thomas would be willing to get tested as a potential donor. The words felt heavy in his mouth. I know it's an enormous thing to ask. I have no right to ask it. I'll talk to him, Catherine promised. But this has to be completely his decision. 2 days later, Thomas sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling before him. Catherine had called him last night with the news about Victor's condition. He hadn't been able to sleep since. Thomas's feelings about his father were complicated. He had moved past the anger of his teenage years, but there remained a sadness for what might have been. Victor had paid for his education and occasionally showed interest in his career, but never tried to truly know him as a person. His phone lit up with a text from Catherine. "Have you thought about what we discussed?" Thomas picked up a sketch pad and began drawing. This was how he always worked through difficult decisions, the pencil in hand. On the paper, he drew two men standing on opposite sides of a bridge. One was reaching out his hand. By evening, Thomas had made his decision. He sent a message to Catherine. "I'll get tested. Not because I owe him anything, but because it's the right thing to do." The next morning, Thomas called the hospital to schedule the initial testing. The nurse asked about his medical history. When Thomas mentioned he had been deaf since birth, she placed him on hold to consult with a doctor. "Mr. Harrington," she said when she returned, "Dr. Chen would like to see you for a comprehensive evaluation before we proceed with the donor testing. Some of your symptoms may require further investigation." Thomas was confused. "Symptoms? I don't have symptoms. I've been deaf my whole life." Dr. Chen specializes in auditory conditions. He's particularly interested in cases like yours. It's standard procedure before organ donation. Thomas agreed to the appointment, not knowing that this routine pre-donor screening would change everything. 1 week later, Thomas sat in Dr. Chen's office, watching the specialist's face as he reviewed the test results. The doctor looked surprised, then excited. "Mr. Harrington," Dr. Chen said, speaking slowly so Thomas could read his lips, "have you ever been told exactly what caused your hearing loss?" Thomas shook his head. He had always been told it was something he was born with, something permanent that he should accept. Dr. Chen pointed to the scan on his computer screen. "I believe you may have a rare condition we've only recently begun to understand. And there's a possibility. I can't promise anything, but a possibility we might be able to help you." Thomas stared at the doctor, not quite understanding what he was seeing on the doctor's lips. Was he saying what Thomas thought he was saying? The kidney donation testing would have to wait. Thomas had just stepped into an unexpected journey of his own. Dr. Chen's office was bright with morning sunlight as he explained Thomas's condition using detailed diagrams. Thomas watched the doctor's hands move across the images of inner ear structures. "You have Mondini dysplasia," Dr. Chen explained, writing the term so Thomas could see it. "It's a rare developmental abnormality of the inner ear." Thomas tilted his head, confused. He had lived his entire life believing his deafness was simply something he was born with, something unchangeable like the color of his eyes. "The remarkable thing," Dr. Chen continued, "is that your case appears to be incomplete. Your cochlea formed partially, not completely absent as previously thought." An interpreter sat beside Thomas, signing each word. Thomas's hands moved quickly in response. "Are you saying there's a chance I could hear?" the interpreter voiced for him. Dr. Chen nodded cautiously. "A new surgical procedure has been developed for cases like yours. It's more advanced than a standard cochlear implant. The success rate is about 60% in similar cases." Thomas's heart raced. He had never defined himself by what he couldn't do. His deafness was part of his identity, part of how he experienced and created art. Yet the possibility of hearing music, voices, the ocean, sent a thrill through him. "What about the kidney donation for my father?" Thomas signed. "That's why I wanted to talk to you first," Dr. Chen replied. "These procedures would need to be timed carefully. Donor surgery is physically demanding. If you choose to pursue both, we'll need to coordinate with your father's medical team." Thomas left the hospital with a thick folder of information. Walking through the park near his apartment, his mind was too full to notice the beauty around him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the urge to sketch what he saw. That evening, he video called Catherine. Her face showed concern when she saw his serious expression. "What happened at the doctor's?" she signed. Thomas took a deep breath and explained everything about the Mondini dysplasia and the potential surgery. Catherine's eyes widened in shock. "All these years," she signed, "we never knew? How could the doctors have missed this?" Dr. Chen said the technology to detect it properly didn't exist when I was a baby, Thomas explained. And later, everyone just accepted I was deaf. Catherine wiped tears from her eyes. "What will you do?" "I don't know yet. but I need to tell Victor about this, and that I'm a match for the kidney donation. The test results had come back that afternoon. Thomas's kidney was compatible with Victor's needs. Two life-changing pieces of news in one day. Catherine's hands moved hesitantly. Are you sure you want to donate? After everything? Thomas nodded. I'm sure. The next day, Thomas took a train to the city where Victor lived. They had arranged to meet at a quiet restaurant for dinner. Thomas arrived early, his stomach tight with anxiety. When Victor walked in, Thomas was shocked by his appearance. The powerful businessman now looked thin and tired, his skin slightly yellow. Illness had stripped away his commanding presence. Victor sat down, trying to hide how exhausted the short walk from the car had made him. An interpreter joined them, a service Victor had arranged. Thank you for coming, Victor said, his words translated into fluid signs. Thomas nodded, then handed Victor a folder with his test results. I'm a match, he signed. I can be your donor. Victor stared at the papers, then at his son. Thomas, thank you isn't enough. But you need to understand what you're offering. It's major surgery. Recovery takes weeks. I know, but there's something else you should know, Thomas signed. He slid the second folder across the table, the one containing Dr. Chen's diagnosis and surgical proposal. Victor read through the medical report slowly, his hands beginning to shake. He looked up at Thomas, his eyes filled with disbelief. You might be able to hear. After all these years? Thomas nodded. It's not guaranteed. But yes, there's a chance. Victor pressed his hand against his mouth, overwhelmed. The interpreter quietly translated Thomas's next signs. Dr. Chen thinks the surgeries should be scheduled about 3 months apart. Your kidney transplant first, then my hearing procedure. For a moment, Victor couldn't speak. All the years of separation, of guilt, of distance, and now this moment of connection through their shared medical journeys. Whatever you need, Victor finally said, his voice breaking. Whatever it costs, I'll make it happen. Thomas studied his father's face. For the first time, he saw not the man who had abandoned him, but a vulnerable human being offering the only thing he knew how to give, financial support. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. 2 weeks before the scheduled kidney transplant, Victor sat alone in his home office. The large house felt empty, as it had for years. On his desk sat a small wooden box he hadn't opened in a long time. Inside were photos of Thomas as a baby, hospital records, and the original diagnosis papers from 25 years ago. Victor read through the old medical report with new eyes. Patient shows profound hearing loss. Cause undetermined, likely congenital. The doctors back then had been so certain. Or had they? Looking closer, Victor noticed phrases he'd overlooked before. Further testing recommended and follow-up evaluation at age 3. Follow-ups that never happened because Victor had removed himself from Thomas's life. The guilt hit him like a physical pain. If he had stayed involved, if he had questioned the doctors, if he had pushed for more answers, could Thomas have received help sooner? His phone rang, interrupting these painful thoughts. It was Dr. Morris. Victor, I've been reviewing the transplant plans with Thomas's medical team. There's something we need to discuss. Can you come to my office tomorrow? The next day, Victor and Thomas sat side by side in Dr. Morris's office. Although they had met several times to plan the transplant, they had never truly talked about the past. Dr. Morris looked at them both seriously. Before we proceed, I need to make sure you both understand something. This transplant creates a lifelong connection. Victor, you'll need to take anti-rejection medication forever. And Thomas, there could be health complications for you down the road. We understand, Victor said while the interpreter signed his words. Good, but there's another reason I called you both here. Dr. Morris leaned forward. In my experience, transplants between family members work best when there's emotional healing as well as physical healing. Have you two discussed the circumstances that separated you? An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Thomas stared at his hands. Victor looked out the window. Finally, Thomas signed, and the interpreter spoke. We haven't really talked about it. Dr. Morris nodded. I recommend you do, before the surgery. Not just for emotional reasons, but because stress and unresolved trauma can affect physical recovery. After they left the hospital, Victor suggested they go to a nearby park. They found a quiet bench beside a small pond. For several minutes, they sat watching ducks swim in circles. "I don't know where to start," Victor said, his words translated by the interpreter who had come with them. Thomas took out his sketchbook and wrote a question he had wanted to ask for 25 years. "Why did you give me up?" Victor read the words and closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he decided to tell the complete truth. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid I would fail you. When the doctors said you were deaf, I panicked. I didn't know how to be a father to any child, let alone one with special needs." Thomas wrote quickly, "Did you ever regret it?" Victor nodded. "Every day. But the longer I stayed away, the harder it became to return. I told myself you were better off without me." Thomas's pencil moved across the page. "I needed a father more than I needed your money." The simple words struck Victor like a blow. "I know that now," he said quietly. "I made the biggest mistake of my life." Thomas stared at the pond for a long time. Then he wrote something else. "Catherine showed me all your cards and gifts. You never missed a birthday." "It was the least I could do," Victor said. "I convinced myself that providing financially was enough." Thomas' next question was harder. "Did you ever love me?" Victor's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, from the moment you were born. I just didn't know how to show it." As the sun began to set, Thomas drew a quick sketch in his book. Two figures sitting on a bench, the space between them smaller than it had been before. He showed it to Victor, then wrote beneath it, "We can't change the past, but maybe we can build something new." Victor looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not just his own features reflected back, but a strong, talented young man who had thrived despite his absence. "I'd like that," Victor said. "Very much." As they walked back to the car, their shadows stretched long behind them. The kidney transplant was scheduled for the following week. Neither knew what the future would bring, but for the first time in 25 years, they would face it together. The morning of the transplant arrived with a gentle rain tapping against the hospital windows. Thomas was already in his pre-op room when Victor was wheeled in to say goodbye before their surgeries. Thomas nodded, then signed. Not about the surgery, about what comes after. Victor understood. In the weeks since their conversation in the park, a fragile new relationship had begun to form between them. Both wondered if it would survive the stress of recovery and whatever came next. Dr. Morris entered with 2 surgical teams following behind him. "It's time," he said. "We'll take Victor first, then Thomas once we're ready for the kidney." As they prepared to wheel Victor away, Thomas suddenly reached out and grabbed his father's hand. It was the first time they had touched since their awkward handshake at that gallery meeting years ago. "Thank you," Victor whispered, tears in his eyes. Thomas nodded, his own eyes bright with emotion. The operating rooms were next to each other, connected by a special corridor designed for organ transplant procedures. In one room, surgeons worked carefully to remove Thomas's healthy kidney. In the other, Victor's medical team prepared him to receive the life-saving organ. Catherine sat in the waiting room, flipping through magazines without reading them. Paul, her husband, brought her coffee and sandwiches she couldn't eat. The hours stretched endlessly. "Family of Victor and Thomas Harrington," a nurse called finally. Catherine jumped up. "Yes, that's us." "Both surgeries went well," the nurse explained with a smile. "Thomas is in recovery now. Victor's body is accepting the new kidney so far." Relief washed over Catherine. She had worried about Thomas taking such a risk, even as she understood his reasons. Later that evening, when Thomas was awake enough for visitors, Catherine came to his room. She found him sketching weakly on a small pad. "Always the artist," she signed with a smile. "How do you feel?" "Sore," Thomas signed back with one hand. "But okay, how's Victor?" "Doing well. The doctors are very pleased." Thomas nodded and returned to his sketch, a drawing of 2 hospital beds with a kidney floating between them. Even in pain, his sense of humor remained. The first week of recovery passed slowly. Thomas was released from the hospital after 5 days, while Victor needed to stay longer for monitoring. Thomas surprised everyone by asking to visit Victor daily, sitting beside his bed for hours. They didn't talk much during these visits. Sometimes Victor slept while Thomas sketched. Other times, they watched TV together, the captions turned on. Occasionally Victor would point to something on screen, and Thomas would nod or shake his head. They were learning to communicate in their own way. 2 weeks after the surgery, Victor was finally well enough to go home, but he didn't want to return to his empty house. "I've been thinking," he told Thomas during their final hospital visit. "I own a small guest house near the lake. It's quiet there, good for recovery. Would you consider staying there with me? Just until we're both stronger." Thomas looked surprised. He hesitated, then signed. "What about my hearing surgery? It's scheduled for 3 months from now." "We could stay until then," Victor suggested. "I could help you prepare for it." Thomas thought about his apartment in the city, his studio filled with half-finished paintings. He thought about the years of separation and the chance to rebuild what had been lost. "Okay," he signed finally, "but I need to bring my painting supplies." A week later, they moved into the lake house. It was smaller than Victor's main home but still luxurious, with large windows overlooking the water. Thomas set up an easel in the sunroom, where the light was perfect for painting. Their days fell into a simple rhythm. Mornings were for rest and medication. Afternoons, they would sit on the deck watching birds skim across the lake. Victor learned a few basic signs, and Thomas began teaching him more. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, Victor noticed Thomas looking at him thoughtfully. "What is it?" he asked. Thomas took out his notebook and wrote, "I've been thinking about my hearing surgery. I'm scared." Victor read the words and nodded. "Of course you are. What if it changes who I am?" Thomas wrote, "I've been deaf my whole life. It's part of me." Victor considered this carefully before responding. "You'll still be you. Your art, your kindness, your strength, that doesn't come from your ears." Thomas smiled slightly and wrote, "Will you be there when I wake up?" Victor placed his hand over his son's. "I promise. Whether you can hear me or not, I'll be there." As night fell over the lake, father and son sat side by side, watching the first stars appear. The space between them was no longer filled with years of absence, but with a cautious hope for what might come next. 3 months passed at the lake house. Victor's recovery progressed well, his body accepting Thomas's kidney without complications. Thomas regained his strength quickly, spending hours each day painting the lake in different lights. Together, they established a routine that felt surprisingly comfortable. The day before Thomas's hearing surgery, they drove back to the city. The hospital room looked cold and impersonal after their peaceful time at the lake house. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed in his hospital gown, his hands trembling slightly. "Remember," Dr. Chen had explained during their last consultation, "even if the surgery is successful, it will take time for your brain to learn how to process sounds. Don't expect to understand speech immediately." Victor watched his son's nervous movements and wished he could do more to help. They had grown closer during their time at the lake, but Victor still felt the weight of his 25-year absence. "I brought you something," Victor said, motioning for the interpreter to translate. He handed Thomas a small wooden box. Inside was an old pocket watch with intricate engravings. Thomas ran his fingers over the smooth metal and looked up with a question in his eyes. "It's not about time lost," Victor clarified. "It's about time ahead of us." Victor read the question and felt his throat tighten. What words could possibly matter enough to be the first his son might hear? Before he could answer, Dr. Chen with the surgical team. "It's time, Thomas. Are you ready?" Thomas nodded, looking one last time at Victor before they wheeled him away. Victor nodded. "He didn't get that from me." "You'd be surprised," Catherine replied. "You're more alike than you think." Finally, Dr. Chen appeared, still wearing his surgical cap. "The procedure went well," he announced. "Now we wait to see how his brain responds." Thomas spent the night in recovery. The next morning, nurses helped him sit up in bed as Dr. Chen carefully removed the bandages around his ears. The moment had arrived to activate the implant. Victor stood beside Thomas, holding his hand. Catherine waited near the door with the interpreter, though they hoped his services would soon be less necessary. Dr. Chen made final adjustments to the external processor, then nodded to his assistant. "We'll start with very low volume," he explained. "Ready?" Thomas took a deep breath and nodded. The assistant pressed a button on the computer. Thomas's eyes widened instantly. His hand squeezed Victor's so tightly it hurt. "Can you hear something?" Dr. Chen asked, watching Thomas carefully. Thomas nodded, tears filling his eyes. The sound was strange. Not clear like people imagined hearing to be, but a series of buzzes and hums that his brain didn't yet know how to interpret. Still, it was sound, the first he had ever experienced. Dr. Chen smiled. This is just the beginning. Your brain needs time to learn what these signals mean. We'll work with a specialist every day. Thomas looked at Victor, his eyes asking the question they had discussed the night before. Victor leaned closer to his son. Thomas, he said slowly, his voice trembling with emotion. I love you, I'd always have. Thomas watched his father's lips, feeling the strange sensations in his ears. He couldn't understand the words yet. That would take months of training, but for the first time, he could feel the vibration of his father's voice. Thomas placed his hand on Victor's chest to feel the words again. Then he opened his mouth and tried to speak. The sound that came out was unclear, unpracticed, but it was the first sound he had ever deliberately made. I know, the interpreter translated from Thomas's following signs. And I forgive you. 6 months later, Victor stood in a crowded gallery, watching people admire Thomas's latest exhibition. The collection was called Sounds in Color, paintings created as Thomas learned to hear. Swirls of blue and green represented the sound of water. Bold red strokes captured the startling noise of a car horn. Thomas moved confidently through the crowd, wearing his processor discreetly behind his ear. His speech therapist had helped him develop the ability to say simple phrases, though he still relied on sign language for complex conversations. Dad, he called, spotting Victor by the window. The word was slightly unclear but unmistakable. Come see. Victor followed his son to the final painting in the exhibition, a portrait of 2 men sitting by a lake at sunset. One older, one younger, the space between them bridged by a single beam of light. The title card beside it read simply, What Healing Sounds Like. As they stood together before the painting, Victor realized that the greatest gift wasn't that Thomas could now hear his voice. It was that after 25 years of silence between them, they had both finally found the courage to listen.